29 months of exhaustion, 4 hours of sleep, and every cent of his savings, Kofi Mensah sacrificed everything for his wife's beauty studio.
But standing outside her office that morning, he realized a painful truth that changed his life.
Kofi Mensah stopped breathing the moment he heard his wife laugh. It was 4:18 in the morning, and the only reason he was home that early was because the warehouse conveyor belt had jammed, cutting his overtime short for the first time in 11 months. His shoulders were aching, his palms were raw from lifting freight, and his cheap black lunch bag was still hanging from 2 fingers when he reached the side entrance of the beauty studio he had spent almost 3 years helping his wife build. The light inside was on. At first, he smiled. Amara was always saying real success belonged to people who stayed later than everyone else, people willing to suffer in private before they shined in public. Kofi had believed that. He had believed it so deeply that for 29 months he had driven a delivery van in the mornings, worked inventory at a warehouse at night, and spent his weekends doing private security shifts outside office buildings that never even learned his name. He thought he was carrying their future. Then he heard her voice through the half-closed office door. Kofi was never the dream, she said, laughing softly into her phone. He was the funding phase. Kofi froze. For a second, his mind refused to accept the words. It searched for context, for a joke, for some explanation that would make that sentence belong to another woman in another building talking about another man. But then Amara kept going. He still thinks all this is ours, she said. That's what makes it easy. Quiet men always think sacrifice turns into love. There was another voice on the call, a woman, maybe her cousin Nadine, maybe one of the Salon girls, Kofi couldn't tell. He only heard laughter in response, and then Amara said the sentence that split his marriage open like cracked glass. Once the second branch opens, I won't need him at all. The lunch bag slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. He stared through the narrow strip of glass in the office door and saw his wife sitting barefoot in the leather chair he had bought from a wholesaler in Easton, her phone pressed to her ear, her polished nails drumming on a desk he had assembled himself after a 14-hour shift. Her hair was wrapped in silk, her face relaxed, her smile easy. It was the face of a woman completely unafraid of being discovered. Kofi took one step back, then another. Not because he was weak, because in that moment he understood something that strong people learn too late. Sometimes your life does not collapse with noise. Sometimes it collapses quietly, under fluorescent lights, while someone you trusted speaks about your pain as if it were a useful household appliance. For 29 months, Kofi Mensah had been living on 4 hours of sleep and cheap coffee, because Amara's dream, according to her, needed one final push, one final payment, one final sacrifice, one final season of struggle before everything changed. The first time she cried in front of him about money was 8 months after their wedding. She sat on the edge of their bed with 2 envelopes in her lap and told him the small beauty room she was renting inside another salon had become impossible. The landlord was raising rates. Her equipment was old. Clients loved her, she said, but she could never scale under somebody else's roof. She needed her own place, her own brand, her own sign, her own chance. Kofi remembered exactly what she had said, because he had repeated those same words to himself on nights when his body felt too broken to stand. "If I can just get my own space," she whispered that night, tears running down both cheeks. "I promise I'll never forget what you did for me." He believed her, because Kofi came from the kind of upbringing where promises still meant something. His father had worked 31 years as a mechanic in Kumasi before immigrating late in life, and he used to say a person's character always reveals itself around money, pressure, and opportunity. Kofi had laughed at that when he was younger. It sounded too simple, too old-fashioned, too suspicious. Now, standing outside that office, he realized his father had not been suspicious enough. The studio had cost far more than Amara originally admitted. First, there was the lease deposit, then the plumbing upgrade for the wash stations, then the custom mirrors, then the website, then the branding, then the reception desk, then the chairs she insisted had to look premium because rich women don't trust cheap furniture with expensive hair. Then inventory, then payroll gaps, then influencer packages, then emergency rent during a slow season, then a second loan because the first one wasn't structured properly. Each time, Amara came to him with the same formula. A hug first, fear second, faith last. Kofi, just one more stretch. Kofi, this is temporary. Kofi, when this works, I'll take care of you for the rest of your life. And because he loved her, because he mistook endurance for partnership, because he was the kind of man who would rather bleed privately than watch his wife panic publicly, he said yes. Again and again and again. By the start of that winter, Kofi had put in $84,620 of direct support into the business. He knew the number because he tracked everything. Not because he was controlling. Because once, early in their marriage, a direct debit had bounced and nearly shut off their apartment electricity, and the shame of that moment changed him. Since then, every payment, every transfer, every receipt, every business invoice tied to his account went into a black accordion folder in the hall closet and a spreadsheet on an old laptop with a cracked hinge. Amara used to tease him about it. "My husband treats receipts like they're family photos." He would laugh and kiss her forehead. Now those receipts felt less like paperwork and more like witnesses. Kofi stayed outside the office for another minute and listened. He heard enough to destroy whatever was left of his illusions. Amara talked about him the way people talk about a temporary lender. Useful, reliable, replaceable. She said he was too tired to ask questions. Said he preferred peace over truth. Said men like him mistake being chosen for being loved. Then she bragged that she had already started shifting certain purchases through a separate business account he didn't know about. That was when Kofi stopped feeling hurt and started feeling cold. Pain makes people emotional. Evidence makes them dangerous. He bent down, picked up his lunch bag, stepped away from the office door, and walked back into the alley behind the studio without making a sound. He sat in his van with the engine off until sunrise, staring at the windshield while the world slowly turned blue. At 6:02 a.m., he opened his notes app and typed one sentence. 4:18 a.m. Heard Amara say, "Kofi was never the dream. He was the funding phase." Then he added another line. "Find out everything before she knows I know." That same afternoon, he called in sick to the delivery route for the first time in 2 years and went home. Amara was asleep when he entered the apartment. One arm draped across his side of the bed, silk bonnet still on. The same woman who had kissed him 3 nights earlier and thanked him for believing in greatness before it was visible. Kofi stood there for a long time, just looking at her. Some men would have woken her up. Some would have screamed. Some would have thrown things. Kofi opened the closet instead. The black accordion folder was exactly where he left it. By noon, his dining table was covered with receipts, account printouts, lease agreements, utility statements, card records, contractor invoices, delivery manifests, and business registration papers. He found at least 12 transactions he did not remember approving. He found supplier bills routed through a business debit card he had never seen. He found luxury purchases disguised as client hospitality. He found a monthly transfer labeled consulting that went to a man named Lionel Voss. He also found something that changed the case completely. A pre-approval email for a second commercial location. Amara had applied 3 weeks earlier. Not with both of them listed as owners. With herself listed as majority owner and Kofi listed as personal guarantor. No conversation, no consent, no warning. Just his name, his income, his credit, his risk, used like borrowed furniture. Kofi sat back in his chair and laughed once, the kind of laugh that has no joy in it at all. Because now he finally understood why Amara had been pushing him so hard to accept more overtime and delay their plans to move his mother into a better apartment. She wasn't trying to save their future. She was scaling her exit. At 2:40 p.m., Kofi booked an appointment with a family attorney and a financial litigator. The earliest opening was 48 hours later, Thursday at 11:30 a.m. He wrote it down. 48 hours. That became his countdown. For the next 2 days, Kofi did what exhausted men who have finally run out of illusions do best. He became efficient. He copied everything. He downloaded statements. He photographed contracts. He forwarded business emails from the shared printer account. He checked the security app connected to the studio cameras and found clips of Amara meeting Lionel twice after closing. Nothing romantic. That wasn't even the point anymore. What mattered was that she had told Kofi those nights were inventory audits, while footage showed them touring the back room, measuring walls, and discussing floor plans for a second location. She was building an expansion plan behind his back, while still using his labor to fund the first one. The more Kofi uncovered, the less he felt like a husband, and the more he felt like a mule that had finally seen the cart. Thursday came. Attorney Adana Okafor did not waste time with sympathy. She listened for 18 minutes without interrupting, her fingers folded over a yellow legal pad, while Kofi laid out the marriage, the business support, the recordings in his memory, the new lease email, the hidden transfers, the unsigned liability risk, and the voice he could still hear in his head calling him a funding phase. When he finished, she leaned back and said, "Mr. Mensah, emotionally, you were used. Legally, we need to prove where support became deception." Kofi slid the folder toward her. Then another. Then the laptop. Then the printout of the second location pre-approval. Adana looked at the documents for less than 2 minutes before her expression changed. "When did she list you as guarantor?" "3 weeks ago." "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Did she tell you?" "No." Adana nodded slowly. "Good. That helps." Good. It was the first good word Kofi had heard all week. For the next hour, Adana built the map of his escape. Separate finances immediately. Freeze all voluntary transfers. Remove personal guarantees where possible. File for divorce. Petition for reimbursement of identifiable business contributions made under misrepresentation. Demand full business discovery. Challenge any debt created through unauthorized use of his financial profile. And above all else, do not confront her until they were ready. "She is counting on your emotion," Adana said. "People who exploit dependable partners usually believe dependable partners will also stay predictable. We're going to disappoint her." That afternoon, Kofi opened a new bank account. By evening, automatic payments tied to Amara's business stopped flowing from his salary. By Friday morning, Amara noticed. She called him 7 times before 9 a.m. Her first messages sounded confused, then hurt, then offended, then furious. "Kofi, the merchant payment bounced. Kofi, payroll is due. Kofi, why is the transfer missing? Kofi, answer your phone." He answered at 10:12 a.m., not because he wanted to, because Adana told him the first calm conversation matters. Amara's voice came through sharp and breathless. "Why did you stop the transfer?" Kofi looked out across the warehouse loading yard and said, very quietly, "Because I'm no longer funding phases." Silence. Not long. Just enough for Truth to realize it had been seen. Then Amara laughed once. "What does that even mean?" "It means I heard you." Another silence. Then the performance began. You know the one. Denial first. "Kofi, you must have misunderstood." Then blame. "You were spying on me?" Then tears. "I was venting. I was tired. I was angry." Then attack. "You choose the worst possible moment to become insecure." Kofi let her cycle through every mask. When she was done, he said, "My lawyer will contact you," and hung up. By 1 p.m., she was at his mother's apartment. By 4 p.m., she had called his sister. By evening, she had posted a vague quote online about disloyal men abandoning women during their building season. What Amara didn't know was that Kofi had already printed the post. Not because it mattered legally, because patterns matter psychologically. A person exposing themselves in public is often halfway to exposing themselves in private. The divorce filing landed Monday. The business disclosure request hit 2 days later. That was when Amara realized this wasn't a marital argument. This was a controlled demolition. And suddenly, the woman who once said quiet men are easy began discovering how terrifying silence becomes when it is organized. Her lawyer responded aggressively. They claimed Kofi's payments were gifts. They said the business was always hers. They suggested he had become resentful of her success. They implied he wanted ownership of something he did not build creatively. Adana expected all of it. What they did not expect was the level of documentation. Kofi had timestamps. He had deposits. He had invoice chains. He had texts in which Amara directly asked him to cover rent, stock orders, styling chairs, rebranding packages, payroll shortages, and emergency tax payments, always promising partnership, shared growth, or eventual joint security. Most importantly, he had a series of messages from 6 months earlier where Amara wrote, "When the second branch opens, we'll finally breathe. Then it's our turn." Our. That single word would later become one of the most expensive lies she ever typed. 2 weeks into the process, business records started arriving. The numbers were uglier than even Kofi expected. Amara had been paying herself more than she told him. She had expensed personal shopping under brand development. She had transferred thousands into a side account connected to a private consultant arrangement that, according to invoices, included travel planning, market scouting, and expansion hospitality. Expansion hospitality turned out to include boutique hotel stays, restaurant bills, and a designer handbag she told Kofi had been a free gift from a loyal client. When Adana laid the records out across her conference table, she said, "She did not just deceive you emotionally. She built a financial story around your trust." Kofi stared at the documents. He should have felt rage. Instead, he felt clarity. Because betrayal is hardest when it still confuses you. Once it starts making sense, it loses some of its power. The mediation date was set for the second week of March. Until then, Amara kept trying to break his discipline. Some days she texted like a wounded wife, "You're really going to throw away everything we built?" Other days she sounded cold and transactional. "If you cripple the business, you'll hurt employees too." Then came the apology messages. Long paragraphs, voice notes, tears, regret, childhood trauma, pressure, fear, loneliness, claims that she said cruel things because success had changed her. Promises to step back. Promises to fix accounting. promises to sell assets and repay him privately if he stopped making this ugly. Kofi sent every message to Adana. He replied to none of them. The only thing he said during that month came when Amara cornered him in the parking lot outside his security shift. She stood beside his car in a cream coat he had bought for her on their anniversary and whispered, "Do you really hate me that much?" Kofi looked at her for a long moment before answering, "No, that's why this hurts. If I hated you, I would have seen you sooner." The mediator, Helen Mbeki, had been handling high-conflict financial divorces for 16 years and carried herself like someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior a long time ago. Even so, Amara's case tested her patience. The first hour went exactly how these stories always go. Amara positioned herself as misunderstood. Her lawyer framed Kofi as emotionally withdrawn and financially controlling. They suggested the marriage had simply suffered under the pressure of entrepreneurship, that words were said in frustration, that spouses sometimes exaggerate on private calls, that Kofi was trying to transform emotional disappointment into legal punishment. Then, Adana started opening folders. Rent subsidies, chair purchases, payroll rescue transfers, insurance coverage, utility backfills, branded packaging, contractor deposits, card statements, text chains, pre-approval letters, hidden accounts. The room changed shape. You can feel it when that happens, when confidence begins leaving one side of the table and crossing the floor. Helen asked Amara directly whether Kofi had ever been told about the second branch application. Amara adjusted in her chair. "I was going to tell him." "That wasn't my question," Helen replied. "No." Adana then placed 3 printed screenshots in front of the mediator. One was the message where Amara promised the second branch would be our reset. One was the business application listing Kofi as guarantor. And one was a typed note Kofi had written within minutes of overhearing the phone call, time-stamped and preserved. Later supported by a follow-up message where Amara herself texted, "I said stupid things, but you know I didn't mean them like that." Helen read the documents twice. Then she looked at Amara and asked the question that broke the performance. "Did you represent this business to your husband as something he was helping build for both of you, while privately structuring it to exclude him?" Amara didn't answer immediately. People rarely do when the lie finally has nowhere left to stand. Then, with the kind of frustrated honesty that only appears when manipulation stops working, she said, "He was supposed to understand the bigger picture." Helen's face didn't move. "And what was the bigger picture?" Amara sighed, crossed her arms, and muttered the sentence Kofi would remember for the rest of his life. "Kofi is stable. He was meant to get me there." Not partner, not husband, not builder. A vehicle. Even Amara's own lawyer looked down at the table after that. Mediation ended without settlement, which, in Adana's opinion, was the best possible outcome, because now the court would hear everything. The hearing took place 5 weeks later. Kofi wore the only navy suit he owned, the one he had purchased for a cousin's wedding and never expected to wear in a room where his marriage would be reduced to exhibits, figures, timestamps, and statements under oath. Amara arrived in white. Not bright white. Soft white. Careful white. The kind chosen by someone who still believed appearance could influence consequence. The judge was patient, sharp, and unimpressed by theater. Adana's argument was simple. Kofi had contributed substantial funds, labor, and credit support to a business presented to him as a shared marital future. Amara, while accepting those contributions, privately structured ownership and liability to her advantage, withheld critical financial information, attempted to expose him to unauthorized guarantee obligations, and used emotional representations to keep money flowing. This was not ordinary marital generosity. It was inducement through deception. Amara's side tried to reframe everything as support between spouses. But support between spouses does not usually involve secret expansion plans, hidden accounts, disguised expenses, and unapproved guarantor exposure. The judge noticed that too. When Amara testified, she started polished and ended irritated. At first, she called Kofi a good man who became resentful. Then she called him overly rigid. Then she claimed he misunderstood entrepreneurial pressure. Then, under questioning, she admitted she did not want him involved in ownership decisions because he didn't have the vision. Adana waited. Then she asked one final question. If Mr. Mensah lacked the vision to share ownership, why was his income, credit, and labor acceptable to share the risk? Amara opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her lawyer, looked at the judge, and said nothing. Silence is expensive in court when documents are already speaking. The ruling came 2 weeks later. Marriage dissolved. Kofi released from any attempted guarantee exposure tied to the second branch. Amara held solely responsible for undisclosed business liabilities incurred outside mutual knowledge. Reimbursement awarded to Kofi in the amount of $61,300 based on traceable contributions made under documented misrepresentation and non-disclosed risk. Additional cost sanctions for disclosure failures. Kofi did not smile when he heard the number. People imagine justice feels dramatic. Most of the time, it feels quiet, like finally setting down something heavy you were never meant to carry alone. Amara cried in the corridor afterward. Not delicate tears, angry tears. The kind born when consequence arrives dressed like accounting instead of emotion. She called his name once as he walked away. Kofi, after everything, this is how you leave? He turned around, not because he owed her closure, but because some endings deserve a witness. No, he said. This is how I stop disappearing. Then he left. Recovery did not happen all at once. That's the part channels rush through, but real life never does. Kofi still woke up some nights hearing that sentence. He was the funding phase. For weeks, he kept expecting an apology that actually understood what had been done. It never came. What came instead was distance, then sleep, then appetite, then something he had not felt in years. Space. He dropped the weekend security shifts first, then the warehouse overtime. Within 3 months, he was working one stable route full-time and doing bookkeeping for 2 small transport companies on the side, using the same obsessive record habits Amara once mocked. His mother moved into a safer apartment with proper heating. His shoulders stopped aching every morning. He started going to a gym not because he wanted revenge muscles or internet transformation photos, but because he wanted to feel his own strength belong to him again. One Saturday, while sorting old documents, he found a Salon flyer with Amara's face on it and almost threw it away. Instead, he placed it inside the last page of the black accordion folder and wrote across the back in marker, "The cost of ignoring what I knew." Then he closed the folder and put it on the top shelf, not as a shrine to pain, as proof of survival. A year later, someone asked Kofi whether he regretted helping her. He thought about it carefully before answering. "I regret helping without clarity," he said. "I regret confusing love with unlimited access. I regret thinking silence was peace. But I don't regret being generous. I just learned generosity needs boundaries, or predators start calling it devotion." That answer spread through his church group, then through cousins, then through friends of friends. because people are always shocked when a quiet man finally explains the math of how he was broken. And that, maybe, was the strangest ending of all. Amara had once believed Kofi's silence made him weak. In the end, it was the discipline of that same silence that saved him. Not shouting, not begging, not revenge for the sake of spectacle. Just truth, documented carefully enough that it could stand on its own feet. If you are listening to this while carrying someone else's dream on your back, hear me clearly. Support should never require blindness. Loyalty should never demand self-erasure. And love that only grows while you shrink is not love at all. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop financing the version of yourself that somebody else depends on exploiting. And sometimes, the life you thought was ending is only the first honest chapter you've had in years. If this story hit you, if you've ever ignored red flags because your heart was louder than your instincts, drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more powerful stories about betrayal, justice, and comeback lessons that actually leave you thinking, like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because the next story might sound a lot closer to home than you expect.